Chapter 9, Key Issue 2, is about development and how development varies by gender in different countries and different regions. So we'll cover the UN's measures of gender inequality, so how do we measure it? And we'll describe the changes since the 1920s in gender inequality. So the gender inequality is measured today by the UN with something called the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. The Gender Inequality Index is based on multiple metrics, so it focuses on empowerment, labor force, and reproductive health. So empowerment looks at the ability of women to achieve improvements in status. And it looked how they determined the empowerment part of the score is they look at the percentage of seats held by women in the national legislature. So do women have any power politically? And the percentage of women who have completed high school. So they feel like they measure political representation and education as measurements of empowerment. We also look at labor force. So what is the female labor force participation rate? Defined as the percentage of women who have full-time jobs outside the home. So if women are allowed to work outside the home, it also implies that they can control money, they have equal financial access, and usually equal education. And the last measurement is reproductive health. So we look at the maternal mortality ratio, so how many women die in childbirth, and we also look at the adolescent fertility rate. So how many people are getting pregnant in their teenage years. Another thing that we sometimes look at with maternal mortality rate is also morbidity rate. So maternal mortality rate is the number of women who die in childbirth, and maternal morbidity rate is the number of women who are permanently injured as a result of childbirth or who die later on from these problems. The Gender Inequality Index replaces other measurements. The Gender Development Index, which was just the Human Development Index that was adjusted for gender. So it was just that same measurement that was skewed for equality. And then the Gender Equality Measure, which also recorded gender inequalities. These were old measures. They were adopted in the mid-1990s, and critics said that they focused too much on the income and not enough on the other indicators of gender equality. So if you were in a country that had lower income, so a country with a lower GDP, even if you had more equality than a more developed country, your scores would automatically be lower because the income is lower. So these measurements aren't really used anymore. So the Gender Inequality Index is the measurement used by the UN since about 2006. If you look at these countries, you want a low gender inequality index. So usually when you're measuring something bad, you want the number to be low. So here you've got the US and Canada and most European countries, China, Australia. The gender inequality index is below 0.30. This kind of peach color, 0.3 to 0.49, includes most of Central America and South America, Russia and Eastern Europe, and a few countries in North Africa, a few countries in South Africa. 0.5 and above is high, and the highest rates of that would be in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Southwest Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are lots of places where no data has been collected. Either they don't measure, there's no way to see the number of women who are working, they don't have the number of women who have graduated from high school, they don't have records for it, so we haven't collected data on it. And you can see that primarily in Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of North Africa, and a couple other places in like Eastern Europe. And some places it makes sense to not have this data. So like South Sudan is in the middle of its own, it's a new country, so data hadn't really been collected. It's only been a country for 6 years, really. And right now it's a brand new country in the midst of its own conflict. And then we've got Western Sahara, which has, conflicted borders, and so data hasn't been collected. But other places, if data's not collected, that could be a concerning fact too. Like, they're not measuring if women are in the representation. They're not recording if women are going to school. They're not recording the number of women who die in childbirth. Like, this indicates like a larger problem overall. If we look at the percent of seats in legislature held by women, this is one part of measuring gender inequality. And so this is part of the empowerment section, right? So if these darker yellow are 20% and above, so 20% of the seats in their national legislature, not local or state or province, but national legislature, are 20% or higher. And you see that most places in Europe are corresponding to that. Some places in in Eastern South America, Australia, Canada, Mexico. The U.S., we're at 19% now, so we actually went up in our last election. We actually have 20% of our Senate seats are held by women and 19% in our Congress, our House of Representatives. So, we're only 31% below the percentage of women in the country. But we're moving up, and that's good. Like, it's good that our numbers in this section are moving up, because our numbers here don't fit the general trend for a developed country. You can say the same thing for France. Now you look at the ratio of female to male rates of secondary education, and the U.S. rocks at this. We have more women than men graduating from college, which is what makes this number kind of sad, because we have more women who are highly educated than men. So 1.0 and above, so either equal numbers of men and women are graduating from college. And this is a better way to look at it, because this holds it separate. Like, even within a country, like if you have to work on education for your Human Development Index and access to education, if you still have equal numbers of men and women graduating, even if you need to improve the overall system, the system isn't skewed for gender in that case. And so they look at just how many women are graduating from college or from high school compared to how many women are graduating, how many men are graduating from high school. Again, the U.S., we have more girls graduating from high school and more girls graduating, or women at that point, I guess, graduating from college. So we rock at this section. And the next section is that labor force, right? Are women allowed to work? So 0.8 and above means that for every one man working full-time outside the home, at 0.8 women are. And again, you see in Europe, it's a little skewed. There's more women who are staying home, but it's still pretty close, because it's 0.7 to 0.79. So the difference between the dark orange and the lighter orange might even just be 1 percentage point, so keep that in mind. But so U.S., Canada, most of Eastern Europe, Australia, and parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. And then you got here below this with a 0.7. So less than 70% of the workforce is women then. So if you look at like Mexico here, for every one man that's working, less than 0.7 of a woman would be working. So you have more men working full-time outside the home. Same thing here in South Asia, Southwest Asia. I guess this part isn't really a huge surprise. And again, there's places where there's no data collected. Again, Western Sahara, the borders are contested. South Sudan, at the time this book was published, it was a country that was only a year old. And now it's only 6 years old, but with lots of political problems. The next measurement is deaths of women per 100,000 live births. So in this case, you don't want your number to be high. So in most of Sub-Saharan Africa, there's 150 or more women dying for every 100,000 live births. The U.S. is ranked with most of Europe. It's below 30 per 100,000 live births. I believe it's still Afghanistan that has the highest maternal mortality rate in the world. But it might have changed, but it would still be ranked, one of the highest. One disturbing trend within the U.S. is while our numbers are still far better than, most of the world, because we're still in that below 30 women dying per 100,000 live births. This number is increasing for us. So we're one of the few, not only developed countries whose number is increasing, but we're one of the few countries in the world who have more women dying in childbirth today than they did 10 years ago. And so that indicates, a larger structural problem that we need to work on, within our healthcare systems. We need to look at, why do we have more women in our country dying today in childbirth than we used to, and what can we do to fix it? Because we shouldn't be, going against the grain on that trend. And there are some states where the maternal mortality ratio has gone up so much that that patterns in that country look more like they are in a developing country than in a highly developed country. And so while we're still doing better than a lot of the world, what's concerning is that every year our percentage gets a little bit worse, and every year their percentage gets a little bit better. So we want to be on that side of staying the same or improving it. If we look at adolescent fertility rate per every 1,000 people, the U.S. has, we're kind of in the middle ground there. So Canada and Europe, North Africa, China, they all have really, really, really low. So less than 20 teenage girls get pregnant per every 1,000 teenage girls. In the U.S., we're in that 20 to 59. So our numbers are a little bit higher than most of the developed world. And so if we were looking at those sustainable development goals and how could we improve gender equality in the U.S., we could look at how can we improve maternal mortality rates and how can we reduce teenage pregnancies, particularly unwanted teenage pregnancies. If we look at trends, the UN asserts that gender inequality has declined in nearly every country since the 1990s. Keyword there, nearly. So in some countries it's gotten worse. And also since the 1990s, because if you went back to since the 70s, there were some countries that definitely got worse, like Iran and Afghanistan. But since the 1990s, most countries, their gender inequality has been decreasing. The U.S. is one of the few developed countries where the gender inequality index has increased. The reproductive rights are lower in the U.S. compared to other highly developed HDI countries. And the percentage of women in the national legislature is lower than other HDI countries, although it is creeping up slowly. It went from, I don't remember the number in your book, but I thought it was 17% when your book was published. And again, now it's up to 19, almost 20%. So this one is on the rise. But the reproductive rights section with maternal mortality and teenage pregnancy, they're also on the rise. So if you look at the Gender Inequality Improvement Index, we really want it to be a low number because it's showing something that's bad, right? Inequality. And we're still in that 0.05 section. So we're still ranked at the low, within the lowest gender inequality indexes. So we're still doing great. There's just areas we can work on. And that's it for gender equality for now.